A man with a shattered past bought a woman they said was unbreakable. He wasn't looking for a wife, just a pair of hands for his failing ranch. But the woman he bought had a fire in her eyes that promised to either save him or burn everything to the ground. The dust of redemption gap settled on everything. It coated the warped planks of the saloon, dulled the sign on the general store, and clung to the souls of the men who gathered in the town square. Today, that dust swirled with a particular kind of ugliness, stirred by the jeers and laughter of a crowd. In the center of that circle stood a girl, though the hardness in her eyes made the words seem wrong. Her hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, pulled back in a thick, messy braid that fell over one shoulder. Her hands were bound in front of her with coarse rope, the skin at her wrists rubbed raw. She wore a simple dress, torn at the hem and stained with the memory of hard labor. But she did not slouch. Her chin was lifted, her back a straight line of defiance. She was a lone pine on a windswept ridge, refusing to bend to the storm. A portly man, named Jedediah Barlow, stood on a wooden crate beside her, his face flushed with cheap whiskey and self-importance. He was a freighter who'd won her in a poker game, and he'd quickly found she was more trouble than she was worth. $5. Jed bellowed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. $5 for this Spitfire. She's got a strong back, I'll give her that. But her tongue is sharper than a razor, and her wool is tougher than old leather. She'll work your fields, but she'll curse you while she does it. We'll take this wildcat off my hands. The men laughed. One shouted, "Does she cook, Jed?" "Cook," Jed snorted. "She'd sooner poison the stew than stir it for a man. I tried to teach her a lesson in manners. She laid me out with a cast-iron skillet for my trouble." More laughter erupted, cruel and loud. The girl, whose name no one had bothered to ask, simply stared ahead, her blue eyes fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. She looked through the men, past them, as if they were nothing more than ghosts in the dust. Her silence was more powerful than any shout, a wall they could not breach. In the back of the crowd, leaning against a support post for the livery stable, a man watched. His name was Cole Miller. He wasn't a man who drew attention. He was tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of a life of hard work. A faded hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over a face that was all quiet angles and grim lines. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, a permanent reminder of a day he'd rather forget. Cole hadn't come to town for this. He'd come for grain and fence wire, the mundane necessities of a ranch that was slowly bleeding life. His spread, the Whispering Hills Ranch, was all he had left. It was a lonely place, haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. He'd lost his wife and young son to a fever 3 winters ago, and the silence they'd left behind was a constant, aching presence. He worked from sunup to sundown, trying to fill that silence with exhaustion, but it never worked. He watched the girl on the platform. He saw past the dirt and the torn dress. He saw the fierce pride in her posture. He saw the untamed spirit in her eyes, a spirit that mirrored the wild, unforgiving land he called home. The men saw a problem to be broken. Cole saw a survivor. He saw a flicker of the same fire that had once burned in his own heart, before grief had turned it to embers. $3, someone yelled. "I'll give you 3 and a bottle of whiskey." Jedediah scoffed. "She's worth more than that just for the trouble she's caused me." Cole pushed himself off the post. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence had a weight to it that made men pause. He walked slowly through the crowd, his limp more pronounced on the uneven ground. The men parted for him, their laughter dying in their throats. They knew Cole Miller. They knew of his loss, and they respected the quiet dignity with which he carried his sorrow. He stopped in front of the crate, his gaze meeting the girl's for the first time. Her eyes narrowed, a silent challenge. There was no fear in them, only a weary sort of fight. Cole turned his attention to Jedediah. He reached into the leather pouch on his belt. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a dry creek bed. $20, he said. The silence that fell over the square was absolute. $20 was a fortune. It was enough for a good horse, or supplies for half a year. Jedediah's jaw dropped. He stared at Cole as if he'd grown a second head. 20. Jed stammered. For her. That was the offer, Cole said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He pulled out a small stack of coins and pressed them into Jedediah's stunned hand. He didn't wait for a reply. He stepped toward the girl, took out a small pocket knife, and with a single, clean motion, sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. She flinched at his closeness, but didn't pull away. She rubbed her raw skin, her eyes never leaving his face. She was searching for something, a hint of the cruelty she expected, the smug ownership she'd seen in a dozen other men's eyes. She found none of it. His expression was unreadable, as stoic as the mountains behind him. "Come on," he said softly. He turned and started walking toward his wagon, not looking back to see if she followed. He didn't grab her arm or order her to heel. He simply trusted that she would. For a long moment, she stood frozen. The crowd murmured, confused. She looked down at her freed hands, then at the back of the tall, quiet man walking away. He had not bought a possession. He had ended an auction. With her chin held high, she took a step, and then another, following him through the silent crowd and away from the dust of Redemption Gap. The wagon ride to Whispering Hills was silent. Clara, that was her name, though she hadn't offered it and he hadn't asked, sat stiffly on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, watching the rolling plains give way to rugged, pine-dotted hills. The landscape was beautiful in a stark, lonely way. It suited the man beside her. Cole handled the reins with a quiet competence, his movements economical and sure. He didn't try to fill the silence with small talk. He just drove, the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft clopping of the horses' hooves the only sounds between them. Clara was used to men who talked too much, who filled the air with boasts and threats and demands. This man's silence was a language she didn't understand, and it put her on edge more than any loud command would have. She expected him to stop on the trail, to exert the right he had paid for. Every mile that passed, her body tensed, preparing for a fight. But he just kept driving, his eyes on the road ahead. As the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the land, he finally spoke. "We're almost there," he said, his voice calm. She just nodded, not trusting her own voice. The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected on three sides by rising hills. A simple, one-story log house stood near a large, weathered barn whose roof sagged in the middle. The corral fences were in need of mending, and a field that looked like it had once been a vegetable garden was overgrown with weeds. The place felt tired, worn down by time and neglect. But like its owner, it had a solidness to it. The bones were good. Cole pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house. He climbed down, his limp evident as he moved to unhitch the horses. He didn't offer her a hand. Clara was grateful for that. She didn't want his help. She slid off the bench, her feet landing softly in the dirt. She stood there, waiting for instructions, for the rules of this new prison. He led the horses toward the barn. "There's water in the basin on the porch," he said over his shoulder. "House is unlocked." She watched him go, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. He disappeared into the shadowy barn, leaving her alone in the fading light. Cautiously, she approached the house. The porch was a simple affair, just a few wooden planks with a bench against the wall. A tin basin and a pitcher of water sat on a small crate, just as he'd said. She poured some water into the basin and washed her face and hands, the cool liquid a small comfort. The inside of the house was clean but stark. It was a man's home, built for function, not comfort. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room. A simple wooden table with two chairs sat in the center. A door on the far wall presumably led to a bedroom. Everything was neat, but a layer of dust covered surfaces that weren't used often. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a profound loneliness. When Cole came in, he didn't light a lamp. He moved in the twilight with a familiarity born of long practice. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding a few logs until a small fire flickered to life, casting a warm, dancing glow across the room. "There's a room in the back," he said, gesturing with his head toward a second door she hadn't noticed. It was meant for a hired hand. "Bed's made. It's yours." Clara stared at him. A room of her own? She'd always slept in barns, in kitchens, or in cramped lofts where she was never truly alone. A door she could close felt like an unimaginable luxury. "What do you expect from me?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. He looked at her then, his gray eyes seeming to see right through the defensive wall she had built around herself. "I expect you to earn your keep." There's fences to mend, stock to feed, a house to run. The work is hard. If you don't want to do it, the road back to town is easy to follow. He turned back to the fire, his meaning clear. He had offered her a choice. He hadn't bought a slave. He'd hired a hand, albeit in an unconventional way. The $20 had been her passage, not her price. That night, for the first time in years, Clara slept in a real bed, in a room with a door that shut. She didn't bolt it. She lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. She heard the soft groan of the floorboards as Cole moved in the main room, the sigh of the wind outside, the distant call of a coyote. She waited for a footstep outside her door, for the handle to turn, but it never did. Eventually, exhausted by a tension that had no reason to exist, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Dawn broke cold and sharp over the hills. Clara was up before the sun, a habit ingrained in her by years of harsh masters. She found Cole already by the stove, a pot of coffee brewing. He nodded a silent greeting and pushed a tin mug toward her. She took it, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. They drank their coffee in silence. It wasn't an awkward quiet, but a companionable one. The kind of silence shared by people who understand that morning is not a time for words. When they were done, he stood up, grabbing a worn jacket from a peg by the door. "I'm checking the north fence line," he said. "It was damaged in a rock slide last spring. The chickens need feeding, and the horses need to be watered. You can start there." It was an instruction, but it felt like a suggestion. He left, and Clara was alone again. She found the chicken feed in a bin by the back door and scattered it for the small flock. She worked the old hand pump until the trough of the horses was full. The work was familiar, the rhythm of it soothing. It was a language she understood. No one was shouting at her. No one was watching her with a critical eye. As she worked, she explored the ranch. It was bigger than she'd thought, stretching deep into the valley. But it was clear that one man, especially one with a bad leg, couldn't manage it alone. The place was crying out for work, for life. It needed more than one pair of hands. By midday, she had not only done the chores Cole had mentioned, but she had also scrubbed the kitchen floor, cleared the weeds from the stone path leading to the barn, and repaired a broken hinge on the henhouse door. She worked with a fierce, restless energy, driven by an instinct to make herself useful, to prove she was worth the space she occupied. When Cole returned late in the afternoon, he found her in the corral. One of his horses, a young, spirited gelding, had a reputation for being difficult. Cole usually spent the better part of an hour trying to corner and bridle him. He watched now from the shadow of the barn as Clara stood in the center of the dusty enclosure. She wasn't chasing the horse. She was standing perfectly still, her back partially to him. She spoke in a low, soft murmur, her voice a calming hum. The gelding, who usually shied away from everyone, took a hesitant step toward her, then another. His ears were pricked forward, curious. He nuzzled her outstretched hand, and with a movement so gentle and fluid it was almost invisible, she slipped the bridle over his head. Cole watched amazed. He had worked with horses his whole life, but he had never seen anyone with a touch like that. It wasn't about breaking the animal's spirit. It was about earning its trust. He stepped out from the shadows. The horse shied at his sudden appearance, but Clara kept a firm, gentle hand on its neck, murmuring to it until it calmed. "He doesn't usually let anyone get that close," Cole said, his voice filled with a respect he couldn't hide. Clara shrugged, her eyes on the horse. "He's not mean. He's just scared. Most things that act mean are just scared." She looked at Cole then, and he had the feeling she wasn't just talking about the horse. That evening, they ate a simple meal of beans and salted pork at the small kitchen table. Clara had found the supplies in the pantry and cooked without being asked. The food was plain but hearty. For the first time, she asked him a question. "Your leg," she said, her gaze dropping to it for a fraction of a second. "What happened?" Cole's jaw tightened. It was a question no one in town ever dared to ask. He stared down at his plate for a long moment. He could tell her it was none of her business. He could ignore her, but there was a genuine, non-prying curiosity in her voice. "A bull," he said finally, his voice flat. "Few years back. It gored me pretty good. Pinned me against a fence. I was lucky it didn't kill me." He didn't add that his son had been watching, that the boy's screams were a sound that still woke him up at night. He didn't say that the accident was the beginning of his ranches, and his life's slow decline. Clara just nodded. She didn't offer sympathy or pity, for which he was grateful. She just accepted his answer, and the silence that followed was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. They were two people marked by the harshness of the world, each carrying scars, one on the inside, one on the out. Days turned into a week, and then two. A quiet routine settled over the ranch. They worked from dawn until dusk, often side by side, speaking only when necessary. But their silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared language of hard work. He saw the intelligence behind her eyes when she suggested rotating the cattle to a new pasture with better grass. She saw the deep-seated kindness in him when he left a small bundle of wildflowers on the table one morning, a silent acknowledgement of the small garden she had started clearing by the porch. Clara began to change. The rigid defensiveness in her posture softened. The hard, watchful look in her eyes was sometimes replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. She still didn't smile, not a real one, but the deep lines of tension around her mouth began to ease. She was like a wildflower that had found a crack in a rock, a small patch of soil where it could finally begin to grow. Cole found himself changing, too. For the first time since the fever took his family, the silence of the ranch didn't feel so heavy. It was punctuated by the sound of Clara's soft humming as she worked, by the presence of another person sharing the load. He found himself looking forward to their quiet meals, to the simple comfort of knowing he wasn't entirely alone. The ranch was still struggling, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel hopeless. It felt like a place where things could be rebuilt. One afternoon, as a storm was brewing in the west, they worked together to secure a loose section of the barn roof. The wind was picking up, whipping Clara's blonde braid across her face. They were on the roof, the world spread out below them, a patchwork of green and brown under a bruised purple sky. "Hand me that hammer," Cole said, his voice raised against the wind. She passed it to him, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. A jolt, small but unmistakable, passed between them. Their eyes met, and in that instant, something shifted. The wall of silence and sorrow that had stood between them for so long developed a crack. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something quieter, more fragile. It was recognition. It was the startling realization that in this wild, lonely place, two broken souls might just be able to find a way to heal each other. The first roll of thunder echoed through the valley, and the sky opened up. Rain began to fall, cold and hard. But neither of them moved. They just stood there on the roof, the storm breaking around them. And for the first time, the future felt like something other than a long, empty road. It felt like a possibility. The rain came down in sheets, plastering their clothes to their skin and turning the dusty ranch yard into a sea of mud. Cole, quicker despite his limp, slid down the steep pitch of the roof and landed softly on the ground. He turned and held up his arms for Clara. "Jump," he yelled over the roar of the storm. "I'll catch you." For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Trust was a foreign currency, one she had never been able to afford. She looked down at his face, rain streaming from the brim of his hat, his expression steady and serious. It was the same look he'd had in the town square, calm, resolute, and without a hint of deceit. She took a breath, pushed off on the edge, and let herself fall. His arms were strong around her, breaking her fall easily. For a moment, they stood there, soaked and close, the storm raging around them. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was a grounding rhythm in the chaos. He didn't hold on for a second longer than necessary. He set her on her feet, and a new kind of silence, charged and electric, passed between them. "We should get inside," he said, his voice a low rumble. They ran for the house, splashing through puddles. Inside, the fire he had built earlier was a welcoming beacon of warmth and light. They dripped onto the wooden floor, shivering, the adrenaline of the moment fading. "There's a blanket in the chest by the hearth," Cole said, shrugging out of his wet jacket. He turned away, giving her a measure of privacy as he began to stoke the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. Clara found the thick wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her dress was soaked through, and she could feel a deep chill setting into her bones. Cole seemed to read her mind. "Go on into your room and get out of those wet things," he said, his back still to her. "I'll make some coffee." Leave the wet clothes by the fire. They'll be dry by morning. She retreated to the small room, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the storm or the near fall from the roof. She changed into her only other dress, a patched but clean garment, and felt a strange sense of shyness as she carried her wet clothes back into the main room. She laid them carefully on the stones of the hearth, avoiding his gaze. He handed her a steaming mug of coffee, their fingers brushing again. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. His hand was calloused and warm. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had thanked him for anything. "For what?" he asked, his eyes searching hers over the rim of his own mug. "For catching me." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Any time." They sat at the table, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The storm outside made the small, warm house feel like a sanctuary, a safe harbor in a turbulent world. The shared danger, the simple act of trust, had broken down another barrier between them. "You're good with horses," Cole said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Where did you learn?" Clara looked down into her coffee. Her past was a locked box, and she was afraid of what might happen if she opened it. But Cole wasn't pushing. He was just asking. "My father," she said, her voice barely audible. "He raised horses. Good ones. Back in Ohio." It was the first piece of her history she had ever shared. Cole listened, giving her the space to continue if she chose to. "He was a good man," she went on, a faint tremor in her voice. "He taught me how to listen to them. He said most people try to break a horse's spirit. He said you just have to show them yours, and they'll show you theirs." "What happened to him?" Cole asked gently. The light in her eyes flickered and died. "He lost the farm. A bad winter, a worse debt. The man who took it, he took me too. Said I was part of the property." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "I've been passed around since then, from one man who thought he could break me to the next." Cole's hands tightened around his mug, his knuckles white. He said nothing. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just sat with her in the painful silence, his presence a solid, unspoken statement. "I hear you. I see you. I'm not one of them." That night, the storm passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. And in the quiet of the house, a different kind of storm had passed as well, washing away some of the dirt and grime of the past, leaving behind the possibility of something new and clean. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the ranch became the rhythm of their lives, a steady, healing beat. The work was relentless, but it was honest work, and they faced it together. They rebuilt the collapsed section of the north fence, their hammers striking in unison. They rode out to gather the scattered cattle, moving as a team, anticipating each other's actions without the need for words. Clara's garden began to flourish. She had a knack for making things grow, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn, rocky soil. Soon, they had fresh vegetables to supplement their simple diet, and the small patch of color by the porch brought a touch of life to the lonely homestead. Cole started to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. The grim lines around his mouth softened. He began to talk more, sharing stories of the ranch as it had been when his parents were alive, of the dreams he'd had for it before his world fell apart. He told her about his wife, Sarah, and their son, little Jacob. He spoke of them not with a raw, open wound of fresh grief, but with a quiet, bittersweet sadness. He was letting Clara into his memories, sharing the weight of his ghosts. "Jacob loved horses, just like you," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and pink. "He was fearless. He would have been following you around all day, asking 1,000 questions." Clara pictured a small boy with Cole's serious gray eyes and found a pang of sadness in her own heart for the life that had been lost. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. It was a simple gesture of comfort, but for them, it was a momentous step. Cole looked down at her hand, then back up at her face, and a deep, unspoken understanding flowed between them. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. Once a month, Cole had a ride into Redemption Gap for supplies. He used to go alone, but now Clara insisted on going with him. She was no longer afraid of the town. She rode beside him on the gelding she had gentled, her back straight, her head held high. The townsfolk stared. They saw the woman who had been sold like cattle, now riding a fine horse. Her face clean, her eyes clear. They saw the change in Cole Miller, the easing of the terrible sadness that had clung to him for years. Whispers followed them through the dusty streets. Jedediah Barlow, the man who had sold her, watched from the saloon doorway, his face a mask of sour resentment. He saw the way Cole looked at her, the quiet respect and affection in his gaze. He saw the value in her that he had been too blind and too cruel to recognize, and it ate at him. One day, while Cole was inside the general store negotiating credit with the owner, a man named Finn Carter cornered Clara by the water trough. Finn was a bully, a man who got his strength from the fear of others. He'd been one of the loudest mockers at her auction. "Well, look at you," he sneered, blocking her path. "Cleaned up nice. Looks like Miller's found a use for you after all." He reached out to touch her braid. Clara's reaction was instantaneous. She moved with the speed of a cornered cat, her hand grabbing his wrist and twisting it in a way that made his knees buckle. Finn cried out in pain and surprise. "Don't you ever touch me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The wildness was back in her eyes, a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. The commotion drew a small crowd. Cole came out of the store, his face hardening when he saw the scene. He moved to her side, his hand resting on the handle of the Colt holstered at his hip. He didn't draw it. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. "Is there a problem here, Finn?" Cole asked, his voice deceptively calm. Finn, cradling his throbbing wrist, scrambled to his feet. "No problem, Cole. Just admiring your property." The word hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Cole took a slow step forward, and for the first time, Clara saw a flash of the man he must have been before grief had tempered him. There was a cold, hard anger in his eyes that made Finn take a step back. "She is not my property," Cole said, his voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "She is my partner." He turned his back on Finn, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He looked at Clara, his eyes asking if she was all right. She gave a slight nod, the fire in her own eyes softening as she looked at him. He had not just offended her. He had defined her. A partner. An equal. They loaded their supplies and left town without another word, the stares of the townsfolk following them. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Something had been settled, both in the town and between them. That night, after a silent dinner, Cole didn't bank the fire and head to his room as he usually did. He stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit yard. "Clara," he said, without turning around. "What I said in town today, I meant it." She came to stand beside him, the two of them looking out at the familiar landscape, their shoulders almost touching. "I know," she said softly. He finally turned to face her. The moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the fine strands of her blonde hair and the quiet strength in her face. He saw not the wildcat the world had tried to make her, but the resilient, intelligent, and deeply feeling woman she was. "This ranch," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was dying. I was dying with it. Since you came, things are starting to grow again. Not just in the garden." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking the soft skin. It was a gesture of profound tenderness. Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. All her life, a man's touch had meant pain or possession. But this was different. This was reverence. When she opened her eyes, his face was very close to hers. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a quiet, tentative coming together. It was gentle and searching, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and the rain-washed air of a new beginning. It was a promise of healing, a silent vow that in this small, quiet corner of the world, two lonely souls had finally found a home in each other. The kiss ended, but they remained close, their foreheads resting together. The vast, empty spaces inside of them, carved out by loneliness and loss, were finally beginning to fill. "Cole," she whispered, the name feeling new and sacred on her lips. "I'm here," he answered, his voice a steady anchor in the night. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, Clara believed it. She was not a possession. She was not a problem to be solved or a spirit to be broken. She was a partner. She was home. The seasons turned, and the fragile hope that had taken root at Whispering Hills began to blossom. Autumn painted the valley in hues of gold and crimson, and with it came a sense of accomplishment. The fences were mended, the barn roof was solid, and a small herd of healthy cattle grazed in the newly rotated pastures. The ranch was breathing again, its heartbeat steady and strong, mirroring the two souls who tended it. Cole and Clara's love story was not one of grand declarations or flowery poems. It was written in the language they knew best, shared labor and quiet understanding. It was in the way he'd have a fresh cup of coffee waiting for her as the sun rose, and the way she'd mend a tear in his shirt before he even noticed it. It was in a shared glance across the corral, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done. It was in the evenings spent by the fire, where he would read to her from an old, worn book of poetry his mother had owned, his low voice a comforting rumble in the quiet of the house. Clara, who had never known a place of safety, began to let her guard down completely. Laughter, a sound she had long forgotten, started to bubble up from within her. It was a rare and beautiful sound, like water from a hidden spring. It came out one afternoon when one of the barn cats, a scruffy orange tom, tried to help Cole repair a saddle, getting tangled in the leather straps and looking utterly bewildered. Cole's own surprised chuckle joined hers, and for a moment, the years of sorrow and hardship fell away from both of them, leaving them simply as a man and a woman sharing a moment of simple joy. She started to take an interest in the ranch's finances, sitting with Cole at the table as he went over the worn ledger. Her mind was as sharp as her spirit. She saw patterns he had missed, suggesting they sell a few of the older steers at the next market in a town further north, where prices were better. She pointed out that the cost of feed could be cut if they cultivated a field of hay themselves. My father always said, "Never pay another man for what the land will give you for free," she explained, her finger tracing a column of numbers. Cole listened, a sense of wonder filling him. He had been so consumed by his grief and the daily struggle to keep his head above water that he had stopped seeing the possibilities. Clara saw them. She saw a future. He began to rely not just on her strength in the yard, but on her wisdom in the house. They were true partners in every sense of the word. But peace in the West was often a fleeting thing, as fragile as a desert flower. Their quiet world was shattered on a crisp October morning. A rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. He wasn't a neighbor or a lost traveler. He sat on his horse for a long time, a dark silhouette against the bright blue sky, simply watching. Clara felt a prickle of unease. "Who is that?" she asked, her hand shielding her eyes. Cole's face, which had grown so much softer in recent months, hardened into the grim mask she remembered from their first meeting. "Trouble," he said, his voice low. The rider eventually made his way down into the valley. As he got closer, Clara recognized him. It was Jedediah Barlow. But he wasn't alone. Two other men, rough-looking types with guns holstered low on their hips, flanked him. Cole met them in the yard, his stance relaxed but his hand never far from his side. Clara stood on the porch, a heavy iron skillet hanging loosely from her hand, her knuckles white. She had learned that a woman often had to find her own weapons. "Barlow," Cole said, his voice flat. "You're a long way from the saloon." Jedediah spat a wad of tobacco near Cole's feet. His eyes, small and piggy, darted from Cole to Clara, a greedy, appraising look on his face. He'd heard the whispers. He'd heard that Cole Miller's ranch was making a comeback, that the wildcat he'd sold for a pittance was the reason why. "I've come on business, Miller," Jedediah sneered. "It seems I made a bad deal. I've been thinking about that $20 I took for her." He jerked his chin toward Clara. "Wasn't a fair price. Not for a woman who can turn a failing ranch around. I've come to renegotiate." "There's nothing to renegotiate," Cole said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "It was a legal sale. You have the money. Now get off my land." "See, that's where you're wrong," Barlow said, a smug smile spreading across his face. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I was drunk that day, in no fit state to conduct business. I had a talk with Judge Peters over in Blackstone County. He's a reasonable man, especially after a man buys him a few rounds. He agreed that the sale was questionable. He drew this up for me." He held out the paper. It was an official-looking document with a wax seal. It claimed the previous transaction was null and void due to the seller's inebriation and declared Jedediah Barlow, the rightful guardian of one unnamed female, to be returned to his care immediately. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Cole. He knew the document was a sham, a piece of paper bought and paid for by a corrupt judge. But in this part of the country, a piece of paper like that, backed by men with guns, was often all that mattered. That's a lie. Clara's voice rang out from the porch, clear and strong. You were no more drunk than I was. You were just a bully, too stupid to know what you had. Jedediah's face purpled with fury. You see the tongue on her? He snarled at his men. No respect. She needs a firm hand. Something Miller here is clearly too soft to provide. He turned his attention back to Cole. So, here's the new deal. You can keep her, but the price is now $200. Or we take her back with us. And we'll take that horse she's so fond of, too, as payment for our troubles. $200. It might as well have been $2,000. It was everything Cole had, everything they had managed to scrape together for the coming winter. Barlow knew it. This wasn't just about money. It was about humiliation. It was about breaking the thing he couldn't have. Cole looked at Clara. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a defiant fire. There was no fear in them, only a silent question. What are we going to do? In that moment, he knew he would sooner burn the ranch to the ground than let them take her. This was no longer just his land. It was their home. You're not taking her, Cole said, his voice quiet, but with an edge of steel that cut through the tension. And you're not taking anything else. You have 1 minute to ride out of this valley. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly bark. Brave words, Miller. But you're one man, with a bad leg. We're three. You do the math. One of Barlow's men shifted his hand, letting it rest on the butt of his pistol. The message was clear. Cole slowly raised his hands, a gesture of surrender. Barlow's smile widened. Wise choice, he said. Clara, Cole said, his eyes locked on hers. Go inside. For a second, she looked like she would argue. The fight in her was too strong to back down. But then she saw something in his gaze, a flicker of a plan, a silent command that asked for her trust. She gave a curt nod, turned, and walked back into the house, the skillet still in her hand. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a solid thud. Barlow chuckled. Trained her well after all. He and his men dismounted, their spurs jingling as they walked toward Cole. Now about that money. They never saw it coming. The moment the door closed, Clara had moved not to the kitchen, but to the wall above the fireplace. There, resting on 2 wooden pegs, was Cole's old hunting rifle. Her father had taught her to shoot, just as he had taught her about horses. Aim steady, breathe slow, and never waste a shot, he used to say. The window to the left of the door was small, but it gave her a clear view of the yard. She rested the heavy barrel on the sill, took a steadying breath, and lined up her shot. She didn't aim for Barlow. She aimed for the rope holding up the sign above the barn door, the one that read Whispering Hills Ranch. The rifle's crack echoed through the valley, sharp and loud. Barlow and his men jumped, spinning around in confusion, their guns half drawn. At the same instant the rifle fired, Cole moved. His surrender had been a ruse, a way to get them to lower their guard. He lunged forward, not at Barlow, but at the man closest to him. He brought his fists up in a powerful blow to the man's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Before the second man could react, another shot rang out from the house. This time, the bullet kicked up the dirt right at his feet, so close it sent him hopping back like he'd stepped on a hot coal. The next one won't miss. Clara's voice shouted from the window, as fierce and commanding as any general. Barlow stood frozen, his face a comical mixture of shock and fear. The tables had turned in an instant. He was caught between Cole, who now had the first man's pistol in his hand, and a woman with a rifle who clearly knew how to use it. The third man, seeing how things were going, decided he wasn't being paid enough for this. He scrambled back to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and spurred the animal into a gallop, fleeing back the way he'd come. The man Cole had punched was dazed and unarmed. Barlow, a coward at heart, looked from the gun in Cole's hand to the rifle barrel still pointing at him from the window. The fight went out of him completely. He raised his hands, his jowls trembling. All right. No need for anyone to get hurt, he squealed. I believe I told you get off my land. Cole said, his voice dangerously soft. Barlow and his remaining henchmen didn't need to be told twice. They mounted their horses with clumsy haste and rode off, not even looking back. Cole stood in the yard, the pistol still in his hand, until they were just specks in the distance. The door to the house opened, and Clara came out, the rifle held loosely in her arms. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were shining. They met in the middle of the yard, the silence of the valley settling around them once more. Cole looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a smile of pure pride and admiration. "My father also said," Clara said, a tremor of adrenaline still in her voice, "never let a bully think he's bigger than you are." Cole took the rifle from her, his hand covering hers for a moment. "Your father was a wise man." He looked around at the ranch, at their home, which they had just defended together. "We make a good team," he said. "Yes," she agreed, her voice soft. "We do." He leaned in and kissed her, right there in the middle of the yard, in the bright morning sun. It was not a gentle, questioning kiss like their first one. This was a kiss of triumph, of partnership, of a bond forged in shared work, and now tempered in shared danger. They had faced the ugliness of the world and had not flinched. They had stood together, back to back, and they had won. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, they knew that Barlow might come back, that the world was full of men like him. But they also knew that they would face whatever came next the same way they had faced this, together. The wild woman and the quiet rancher had become a fortress, and their home, Whispering Hills, was the ground they would never surrender. The winter that followed was a quiet one, a season of consolidation and deepening affection. The snows came early, blanketing the valley in a pristine white silence. The world shrank to the boundaries of the ranch, to the warm circle of light cast by the fireplace. For Cole, who had endured the previous winters in a haze of solitary grief, it was a revelation. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, filled with the scent of Clara's baking and the soft sound of her voice as she read to him. For Clara, it was the first time she had ever felt truly safe. She learned to sleep through the night, without one ear listening for danger. She learned that a raised voice didn't always mean anger, that a touch could be gentle, and that silence could be a comfort, not a threat. The harsh, defensive lines on her face were replaced by a serene confidence. She was no longer just a survivor. She was the mistress of her own home, a partner in a shared life. They worked together, their days falling into a familiar, comforting rhythm. In the mornings, they would brave the cold to feed the stock, their breath misting in the frigid air. In the afternoons, Cole would repair harnesses and tools in the barn, while Clara mended clothes or planned the spring garden, her sketches of planting beds a tangible promise of the future. The evenings were theirs, a time for quiet conversation and shared dreams. "When the spring thaw comes," Cole said one night, tracing the outline of corral on a piece of paper, "we should buy a few more head of cattle, and maybe a new bull, a good one. If we're going to rebuild this place, we need to do it right. We'll need another hand to help with a larger herd," Clara pointed out, her practical mind always working. "I know," he said, looking at her, his meaning clear. The ranch was growing, and so was their life. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Was it time to make their partnership official, to build a family, as well as a ranch? Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. A husband, a family. These were things she had never dared to dream of. They had seemed like luxuries for other people, for women who hadn't been forged in the fires of hardship and cruelty. But looking at Cole's honest, kind face, she realized it wasn't a dream anymore. It was a possibility, as real and solid as the log walls around them. The thaw came, and with it, a sense of renewal. The valley awoke from its slumber, the brown earth turning green, the creeks swelling with melted snow. Life was returning, and with it, a stranger. He rode in on a fine black horse, a stark contrast to the rugged cow ponies of the region. He was dressed in a city suit, his boots polished, his face clean-shaven. He looked utterly out of place in the rustic, muddy yard of Whispering Hills. He dismounted with a confident air and approached the porch where Cole and Clara were sitting, enjoying a rare moment of rest. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth and educated. "I'm looking for a woman named Clara May Thompson." Clara froze. No one had called her by that name in years. It was a name that belonged to another life, to a ghost. She looked at the man, a vague memory stirring in the back of her mind. He was older now, but she recognized the sharp blue eyes, the determined set of his jaw. "My name is William Sterling," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "And I believe you are the woman I've been searching for." Cole stood up slowly, placing himself slightly in front of Clara. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "I was Clara's neighbor," William explained, his gaze not wavering from her. "More than that, our families had an agreement. We were betrothed to be married, before the trouble." The blood drained from Clara's face. She remembered him now. William Sterling, the son of the wealthiest landowner in their county back in Ohio. Their engagement had been a business arrangement, a way for her father to secure a loan to save their farm. She had been a part of the deal, a commodity to be traded. "That was a long time ago," Clara said, her voice strained. "That life is over." "Not for me," William said, his voice earnest. "Clara, I've been looking for you for 2 years. When my father foreclosed on your family's property, he took advantage. What he did was wrong. When I found out the details, I left home. I sold my inheritance, and I've been using the money to find you ever since." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "I've come to take you away from all this. I have money. We can go anywhere, start a new life. A good life. The life you were meant to have. You won't have to break your back on a failing ranch. You won't have to live in a place like this." He gestured dismissively at the simple log house, the muddy yard. He didn't mean it to be insulting, but it was. Cole's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel Clara trembling behind him. This man, with his fine clothes and easy money, was offering her everything Cole couldn't. He was offering her a world without calloused hands and aching backs. A world where women didn't have to learn to use rifles to defend themselves. A deep, cold insecurity washed over him. What did he have to offer her, really? A life of endless work on a piece of land that had almost broken him. "You should go," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "This is not your decision to make," William retorted, his polished demeanor cracking slightly. He looked at Clara again. "Clara, please. Think about it. You don't belong here. You're a lady." "A lady." Clara finally found her voice, and it was filled with a bitter irony. "I stopped being a lady the day your father's man threw me in the back of a wagon. I have been a servant, a slave, a target, and a joke. I've been bought and sold, but I have never been a lady." She stepped out from behind Cole, her spine straight, her chin high. She was not the frightened girl William remembered. "You say you want to give me a good life," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Let me tell you what a good life is. It's not about money or fancy clothes. It's about respect. It's about looking at the person beside you and knowing they see you, all of you, and they stand with you, not in front of you." She looked at Cole, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love. "This man," she said, her voice softening, "he didn't try to save me. He didn't offer me an easy life. He offered me a choice. He gave me a home when I had none. He treated me as an equal when the world treated me as property. This failing ranch is the first place I have ever been free. This is my life. This is my home." William Sterling stared at her, his confident facade crumbling. He saw the woman she had become, strong and unbroken. He saw the bond between her and the quiet, weathered rancher, a bond forged in something far more powerful than money or social standing. He had come to rescue a damsel in distress, only to find a queen standing beside her king in their own small, fiercely protected kingdom. He gave a slow, sad nod of understanding. The search that had consumed him for 2 years was over, but not in the way he had imagined. "I see," he said quietly. He looked at Cole, and for the first time, he saw not a rival, but a man who had succeeded where he had failed. He had not just found Clara, he had earned her. "I wish you well," William said, his voice heavy with resignation. He turned without another word, mounted his fine horse, and rode away, a solitary figure disappearing back into the world he came from. Cole and Clara stood on the porch, watching him go. The air was thick with unspoken emotions. Cole turned to her, his face a mixture of relief, awe, and a love so profound it hurt. "You chose this," he said, his voice thick. "You chose me." "I chose us," she corrected him gently. She took his calloused hand in hers. There was never another choice. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, burying his face in her hair. The last of his insecurities, the last of his ghosts, were finally laid to rest. He had not just saved her from an auction. She had saved him from a life of emptiness. And together, they had built something far more valuable than anything William Sterling's money could buy. That evening, as the sun set, they sat on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder. The confrontation had shaken them, but it had also solidified what they had. It had forced them to voice the truths that had been growing silently between them for months. "Cole," Clara said into the twilight, "about what you said before the winter, about needing another hand." He turned his head to look at her, his heart suddenly beating faster. "I think you're right," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "This ranch is getting too big for just two people. And this house, it feels like it has room for more." Tears welled in Cole's eyes. He had thought he had lost his family forever, that the sound of child's laughter would never again grace the halls of this house. But Clara, his Clara, was offering him a new beginning, a new family, a future he had never dared to hope for. He didn't need to speak. He simply kissed her, a kiss filled with all the promises of the seasons to come, of a life to be built, of a love that had risen from the hardest ground to blossom in the most unexpected of places. They were no longer just survivors. They were builders. And the future of Whispering Hills Ranch stretched out before them, bright and full of hope. 2 years passed, flowing by like the creek that ran through the valley, sometimes a trickle, sometimes a torrent, but always moving forward. The Whispering Hills Ranch was no longer whispering of sorrow. It was humming with life. The old, sagging barn had been buttressed with new timber, its roof straight and true. The house had a fresh coat of whitewash that gleamed in the sun, and a small new room had been added on, built by Cole's own hands, bore by painstaking board. The fields were no longer fallow. A crop of hay grew tall and golden, promising enough feed for the winter and some left over to sell. The cattle herd was larger, healthier. The ranch was prosperous, a testament to endless work and a partnership that was as solid as the mountains surrounding them. But the greatest change was not in the land or the buildings. It was in the small boy who played on the porch, his hair the color of sun-bleached wheat, his eyes a serious, steady gray. They had named him Daniel. He was a quiet, sturdy child, with his mother's resilience and his father's thoughtful nature. He was the heart of the ranch, the living, breathing symbol of their future. One bright summer morning, Cole hitched the wagon. They were nearly out of flour and coffee, and it was time for a trip to Redemption Gap. In the past, these trips had been a necessity Cole endured. Now, they were different. Clara came out of the house, carrying Daniel on her hip. She had a confidence about her that was a world away from the defiant, cornered girl who had once stood in the town square. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She was a wife, a mother, and the co-owner of a successful ranch. "Are you ready?" Cole asked, a smile touching his lips as he looked at his family. "Always," she said, her eyes smiling back at him. He lifted Daniel from her arms and settled him onto a small blanket in the wagon bed, where he immediately began playing with a carved wooden horse. Cole helped Clara onto the seat, his hand lingering on hers for a moment. It was a small, familiar gesture, a silent reaffirmation of everything they shared. The ride to town was filled with the easy comfort of a long-married couple. They spoke of the weather, of the price of beef, of the funny way Daniel had tried to help feed the chickens that morning. As they rode into Redemption Gap, heads turned. The wagon was sturdy, the horses well-fed. Cole Miller sat tall, the deep lines of grief erased from his face, replaced by a quiet contentment. Beside him sat his wife, her blonde braid neat and tidy, her gaze calm and direct. People no longer saw the wildcat or the broken rancher. They saw the Millers of Whispering Hills, a family to be respected. They pulled up in front of the general store. Cole climbed down and turned to help Clara, but she was already swinging to the ground with an easy grace. He smiled, lifted a sleeping Daniel from the back, and handed him to her. As they walked toward the store, a man stumbled out of the saloon. It was Jedediah Barlow. He was thinner, his clothes more ragged, his face puffy and blotched with drink. He saw them, and his eyes, bleary and full of resentment, narrowed. He opened his mouth as if to say something, to spit some of his old venom. But then he looked at Cole, standing solid and strong. He looked at Clara, who met his gaze not with fear or anger, but with a cool indifference, as if he were a piece of furniture she barely noticed. He saw the sleeping child in her arms. He saw the life they had built, a life he had been too foolish to see the potential for. The fight in him, long since rotted by whiskey and self-pity, crumbled. He said nothing. He just turned and shuffled back into the darkness of the saloon, a ghost of a man defeated by a future he had no part in. Inside the store, the owner, Mr. Henderson, greeted them with a warm smile. "Cole, Clara, good to see you. And how's young Daniel?" "Growing like a weed," Clara said, her voice warm. They gathered their supplies, their movements easy and practiced. As Cole paid, Henderson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Heard you had the best hay yield in the county this year," he said with admiration. "Clara's the one with the head for it," Cole said, looking at his wife with open pride. "She knows what the land needs." Henderson nodded, his eyes showing a newfound respect for the woman he had once seen sold for $20. "It takes a team," he said wisely. "You two are a good team." Later, as they were loading the last of their supplies, Finn Carter, the man who had once accosted Clara, walked by on the other side of the street. He saw them, and he quickly looked away, hurrying his pace. Redemption Gap had learned its lesson. The Millers were not to be trifled with. Their strength was not loud or boastful. It was a quiet, unshakable force, rooted in the land they worked and the love they shared. The ride home was quiet. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Daniel was awake now, babbling softly in the back. Clara leaned her head against Cole's shoulder, her gaze fixed on the familiar hills that marked the entrance to their valley, their home. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked softly. Cole didn't have to ask which one she meant. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I think about the man I was. Empty, just going through the motions." "You weren't empty," she corrected him. "You just had a lot of quiet in you. I was the same, full of noise on the inside, all shouting and anger. We balanced each other." He looked down at her, at the woman who had brought life back to his world, who had filled the silence with laughter and purpose. She had been branded too wild for any man, a force of nature to be broken. But they were all wrong. Her spirit wasn't meant to be broken. It was meant to be matched. As they topped the final rise, the ranch came into view, nestled in the valley below. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the deepening twilight sky. It was more than a collection of buildings. It was their legacy, their sanctuary. It was a place where a man with a shattered past and a woman with no future had found everything they could ever need in each other. He reined in the horses for a moment, and they sat there, simply looking at their home. "You know," Cole said, his voice full of a deep, quiet reverence, "I paid $20 for you." Clara lifted her head and met his gaze, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "And I," she said, "wouldn't have sold you back for all the gold in the mountains." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of forever. The wild woman and the quiet rancher had done more than survive. They had built a love story as rugged and as beautiful as the land itself. If the story of Clara and Cole touched your heart, if you felt the chill of that auction block and the warmth of their first shared fire, then you found a home here with us. At Old West Tales, we believe the greatest romances aren't written in fancy ballrooms, but in the dusty yards of struggling ranches. They are forged by hardship, built on respect, and sealed by a love that is as untamed as the frontier itself. We tell the stories of strong women who refuse to be broken, and the quiet men who are wise enough not to try, the men who choose to stand beside them. If you believe in that kind of powerful, resilient love, the kind that can turn a desolate ranch into a thriving home and a broken soul into a loving heart, then join our community. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and be sure to ring that notification bell so you never miss a tale from the heart of the Old West. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even the wildest spirits can find a place to belong. And let us know in the comments below what part of Clara and Cole's journey moved you the most. Thank you for watching. Remember, out here, love was never easy, but it was always worth the fight. We'll see you next time on Old West Tales.